everyone. Today we're going to be looking at a very special book. One that manages to be a memorial, a time capsule, and a fantastically written engineering analysis. But in order to understand this book and the context behind it, we have to travel back in time. We have to travel back to the 18th of January 1977. On this day, the morning dawned like any other, and at Mount Victoria Station sat train 108. This train was typical of many of the period that was serving the western suburbs and the mountains within the city of Sydney. This train composed of 8 carriages, all made out of wood and all built around the 1930s. They were led by an electric locomotive, the 4620, which, as the name would suggest, it was part of the 46 class of engines, and it was the 20th unit out of a class of 40 engines. At 6:09 a.m, this train departed on schedule from Mount Victoria Station. Being a Blue Mountain service, it stopped along all the stations within the Blue Mountains, and then once it reached the western suburbs of Sydney, it changed status and became an express, stopping at only a handful of major stations before it was meant to finally terminate at Sydney's Central Station, also known as Sydney Terminal. At 8:10 a.m, the train departed Parramatta. Being in the middle of the morning peak hour, it was packed and standing room only. The next stop for this train was Strathfield, but before that it had to pass through Granville. And as it was doing so, it was rounding a curve, and at 78 kilometers an hour, the locomotive derailed. As it derailed, it ploughed into the stanchions that were supporting the Ball Street Bridge just above the roadway. It smashed the stanchions, and the impact caused the locomotive to roll onto its side, where it continued and hit a power pole. While the base of the power pole was demolished, the pole and the cables that were holding it up did not break, and so the power pole swung back and sliced open the first carriage, tragically taking 9 souls within that carriage. By the time the derailed train had come to a stop, the 3rd and 4th carriages were sitting directly underneath the bridge. The Ball Street Bridge was made out of concrete, and it weighed 225 tons. And it certainly was not designed to stay standing with one set of stanchions gone. And the unsupported section collapsed onto the 2 wooden carriages below. Because of this, an additional 75 souls were lost. The Granville train disaster hit a raw nerve within Sydney, and it has entered not only the public consciousness, but Australian modern history. The Granville train disaster remains, since then, as Australia's worst railway disaster. No rail accident in all of Australia comes even close. The next one is the 1908 Sunshine collision, which took the lives of 44 people. The Granville train disaster is commemorated every 18th of January in a ceremony that has come to be known as the Day of the Roses. Survivors, relatives of the victims, and rescuers all get together at the rebuilt Ball Street Bridge, and they throw rose onto the tracks to remember those who did not survive on that fateful day. The Granville train disaster led to many stories making their way into print, and a miniseries called The Day of the Roses was also produced, and I'll discuss more about this later on. However, there is one book that deals entirely with the disaster itself and with a level of depth that is rarely seen in other books. This is Revisiting the Granville Train Disaster of 1977 by Barry Gobb. This book first appeared in 2011 and the volume that I'm holding in my hands is the expanded and revised edition that came out just in time for the 40th anniversary in 2017. The first half of this book is comprised of memories, accounts, and love letters almost, of families of those who did not survive, of those who did survive that fateful journey, as well as the rescuers who did everything they possibly could to save as many lives on that day. Even after 40 years, the humanity of those men and women who boarded that train still remain as fresh as that morning, and the grief for their loss is still raw. This section of the book makes for powerful reading. There will not be a dry eye once you go through those pages. The second half of this book looks at the engineering component. It looks at the formal investigation, which uncovered the pathetically long list of failures, including the woeful lack of maintenance of the track and the absolute negligence in allowing a minimally serviceable train to run on that day. It also has a look at exactly what caused the derailment, and all the engineering analysis is copiously illustrated with lots of diagrams to help visualize exactly what is being discussed. What is also highlighted, and justifiably so, is the cruel treatment that the state government meted out on the next of kin and the survivors. Their utter lack of compassion would be unacceptable in this day and age, and indeed, on the 40th anniversary, the state government issued a formal apology for their behaviour towards those affected people. Now, this disaster continues to reverberate within public consciousness. Emotions run deep, and part of that was illustrated when the miniseries came out, and I will discuss the miniseries in a separate video. For now, we'll just focus on the disaster itself. But what would be interesting with successive editions for this book, as there is much more to be uncovered, particularly in regards to why rail management failed the way it did and why the state government wanted everything hushed up. And hopefully these will be revealed in time for the 50th anniversary, so that this entire sorry saga can finally be put to rest. But in addition to this, what would be interesting to understand from a social memory point of view is, out of all the disasters, why did the producers and directors of the miniseries choose Granville? What was it about this that they thought they could use for the miniseries? How did they go about their research? And while some of that is touched on the book, it would be good to hear from themselves and their approach. How did they meet the technical challenges on a limited budget to recreate on full scale the disaster? What survivor stories did they ultimately choose out of all of the survivors and victims? What made them choose those particular ones that were ultimately told? And how did they handle the hostility towards the production of the series? These are just some questions from a social memory point of view that would make fascinating reading for future editions. This book captures the complete essence of that day. The lives and the emotions of those who boarded that train, those whose lives were changed forever due to a series of terrible oversights and sheer utter negligence, as well as comprehensively and clearly explaining everything that went wrong. In essence, this is almost two separate books, yet as a unit they work together, and it is a fitting memorial to what is Australia's worst preventable railway disaster. I hope you found this video of my review of revisiting the Granville train disaster of 1977 to be insightful and informative. I've included links down below in the description where you can access this book, as well as a companion documentary about the disaster. Check those out, as well as the bibliography for this book, for all the information you ever need about this disaster. I touched upon the mini-series, and if you come over to my next video, I will discuss that as well as discussing more about the locomotive itself. So, until then, stay safe and keep reading.